Hello everyone. In this video, I'll be presenting our work on neighborhood reconstructing autoencoders. I am Yonghyeon-Lee, and this is joint work with Kwon and Frank Park. The neighborhood reconstructing autoencoder is a graph-based autoencoder that explicitly accounts for the local connectivity and geometry of the data. This allows it to learn a more accurate data manifold and representation than existing graph-based autoencoders. Our method, like others, is based on the premise that the manifold hypothesis is valid. Namely, real-world high-dimensional data, such as images, lie approximately on some low-dimensional manifold embedded within the high-dimensional data space. Under this hypothesis, the data representation learning problem consists of two components. First, fit a lower dimensional manifold to the data. And second, find a coordinate chart for the constructed data manifold. Traditionally, the two tasks, constructing the data manifold and finding a coordinate chart, have been addressed separately. The beauty of using an autoencoder is that the two tasks can now be addressed together in a single unified framework. Specifically, given a set of high-dimensional data, a pair of neural networks, the encoder and decoder, are trained to reconstruct the training data. The image of the decoder then corresponds to the learned manifold, and the latent space, together with the pair of functions, g and f, can be considered as the learned coordinate chart. The autoencoder offers an elegant and unified framework for the representation learning problem. As a simple illustration, the one-dimensional data manifold in two-dimensional space shown in the left figure can be discovered by an autoencoder with a one-dimensional latent space. In the ideal case, the decoder should produce a smooth manifold like the orange curve shown in the right figure. However, the autoencoder doesn't always work that well in practice. Two of the most significant problems are overfitting and learning the wrong local connectivity. If the observed data is noisy, then by trying to reduce the reconstruction error, the learned manifold can easily overfit the data. Even when we're given a set of clean observed data, the autoencoder may learn a manifold with the wrong connectivity like the one on the right, because the reconstruction errors are the same for both manifolds. The primary goal of this work is to simultaneously resolve these two issues of overfitting and wrong local geometry. Our key insight is to exploit information on the local connectivity and geometry contained in the neighborhood graph. The first candidate clearly has the wrong local connectivity when compared to the graph, whereas the second and third candidates are correct. Comparing the second and third candidates, the second candidate clearly has the wrong local geometry when compared to the graph, whereas the third candidate has the correct one. The neighborhood graph contains all the essential information needed to conclude that candidate 3 is the correct one. Then the research question that we pose is this: how should we exploit the neighborhood graph to help the autoencoder learn the manifold with the correct local connectivity and geometry? Recently, others have also tried to exploit the graph in the training of autoencoders. We will compare these methods with our method in more detail later. At this stage, we just want to point out that existing methods focus mostly on the regularization of the latent space distribution, and that the regularization terms contain only the encoder. It turns out that it is in fact the decoder and not the encoder that deserves more attention. We'll now introduce the details of our neighborhood reconstructing autoencoder. The NRAE is trained by minimizing a neighborhood reconstruction loss, which we now explain in the following slides. The first step is to construct a neighborhood graph from the set of observed data. It's worth repeating here that the underlying premise in all graph-based autoencoder methods is that the graph is correct for most part. We then determine the neighborhood set of data point x and denote it by n of x. For a neighborhood point x prime in n of x, the neighborhood point reconstruction at x prime is defined to be the local quadratic approximation of the composition function with respect to x. A linear approximation can also be used in place of a quadratic approximation. This reduces the computational burden, and in our later experiments, we examine some of the trade-offs involved in using a linear versus quadratic approximation. Then the neighborhood reconstruction loss for n of x is defined as the sum of the neighborhood point reconstruction errors for all neighborhood points x prime in n of x. Basically, the proposed loss function enforces the smoothness of the autoencoder. Compared to other smoothing regularization techniques, the unique property is that the smoothness is required locally, where the meaning of local is specified by the neighborhood graph. We can also control the degree of smoothness by selecting the order of the approximation. For example, quadratic versus linear. Further, we find that approximating the decoder plays a key role in learning the correct manifold. This finding is verified in our experimental results, but at an intuitive level, it makes perfect sense why this has to be the case. Since the decoder is a mapping from a low-dimensional space to a high-dimensional space, the degrees of freedom in how the learned manifold is embedded is very large. For example, it can be this manifold, or this one, or this manifold. While most existing graph-based methods only focus on the encoder, to successfully learn a correct manifold, taking the decoder into consideration is actually more important than just focusing on the encoder. In our work, we therefore approximate the decoder part only. Approximating both the encoder and decoder leads to an incremental improvement in performance, while significantly increasing the computational burden. The encoder G is used as is, and the decoder F is locally approximated at G of x. To better understand the proposed loss function, we'll now provide a geometric interpretation. First, given a set of observed data, consider a data point x and its neighborhood set n of x. The encoder maps the data point x to the latent value z, and the neighborhood set n of x is mapped to the neighborhood set of z, n of z. We'll assume that the decoder perfectly reconstructs the observed data. And let's assume that the learned manifold looks like the orange curve, which clearly has the wrong local connectivity and geometry. Using the quadratic approximation of the decoder, the image of the approximated decoder looks like the green curve. And the neighborhood reconstruction of n of x is indicated by the green points. Then the neighborhood reconstruction loss is the sum of the lengths of the dashed lines. Unlike the point reconstruction loss function, our neighborhood reconstruction loss function can successfully differentiate between the three candidates and learn the correct manifold. Looking at the sum of lengths of the dashed lines, candidate 3 is preferred under the neighborhood reconstruction loss. One of the really nice features of our algorithm is that its implementation is remarkably easy and simple. We note that we don't need to compute the full Jacobian or Hessian for approximation of the decoder. We only need the Jacobian vector product, which is frequently referred to as the JVP function. The neighborhood reconstruction loss can then be computed as described in the pseudocode. We'll now share some experimental results using our method. We denote our algorithm by NRA-L and NRA-Q. NRA-L uses a linear approximation of the decoder, while NRA-Q uses a quadratic approximation of the decoder. The first two examples shows the denoising property of our autoencoder. Compared to a vanilla AE, the NRAE for both linear and quadratic approximations produces much smoother decoded manifolds. This is because, in our method, each neighborhood set is locally fitted with a smooth model, such as a linear or quadratic model. The second example shows the geometry preserving property. Using the set of rotated and shifted MNIST images, we train a vanilla AE and our NRAE using one-dimensional latent spaces. Once they are trained, we encode the training data to the latent spaces, sort the encoded values in ascending order, and decode these to generate a sequence of images as shown in the figure. Both NRAEs learn the correct order of the set of rotated and shifted images and can generate continuously varying images, unlike the vanilla AE where discontinuities are marked by orange boxes. Finally, we compare the manifold learning performance measured by the test set reconstruction error against the following baseline algorithm. The test set reconstruction errors are reported in the table, where diverse standard benchmark image data sets are used. The best and second best results are colored red and blue, respectively. These results show that NRAEs outperform baseline algorithm in nearly all of our test cases. Especially for cases where the dataset size is small, the NRAE outperforms the baseline algorithm by a significant margin. In conclusion, we have proposed the neighborhood reconstructing autoencoder, a graph-based autoencoder that resolves the overfitting and wrong local connectivity issues associated with many existing graph-based autoencoders. One of our important findings is that the decoder approximation is more important than the encoder. The implementation of our algorithm is quite simple. And finally, experimental results show that manifold learning performance can be significantly improved. There are many more interesting topics discussed in our paper, and we invite you to take a closer look and to reach out to us if you have questions or comments about our work. Thank you for listening. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions.